Red Tales documentary Double Victory, NBC Black and White World War II Vets Reunite, CNN with Frederica Whitfield, and USA Today article published February 6, 2012. Among her accolades are the National Museum of Tuskegee Airmen Distinguished Service Award, Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated Presidential Award. One of her initiatives is Education Through Preservation, and it leads the way in procuring tangible recognition for heroic individuals and groups, places, and events involving Blacks nationwide. Through these and other efforts, including lectures and exhibits, through Ms. Orr's guidance, she has brought to fruition such projects as the Freedom School bombing marker, a historical marker in Indianola, Mississippi, and the renaming of Camp Creek Parkway to Tuskegee Airmen Parkway. She is also a credited contributor to the Georgia 8th grade social studies textbook, Georgia, A History of Change and Progress. Ms. Orr is a distinguished world intellectual as designated by the Biographical Center of Cambridge, England. She is a former national historian of the Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated, and she is the first woman president of the Atlanta chapter of Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated. To quote Ms. Orr, "What an incredible journey from my humble beginnings in Mississippi. With profound appreciation, I give thanks to the Most High for his favor and grace that has allowed me to connect, restore, and enlighten millions to missing pieces of history worldwide. I give you Zelly Rainey Orr."
Good afternoon. It is indeed a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Mr. Gardner, for inviting me out. Ms. Hunter, thank you too for the introduction. We do have an airman, we actually have two airmen here, and if you're part or a veteran of the Air Force, you are an airman. However, as a Tuskegee Airman, those who served in World War II, from 1941 to 49, if you were part of the aviation program that would train blacks to fly, or also the supporting ground unit that would help to make sure the base ran sufficiently, you are a Tuskegee Airman. So from 41 to 49, we have a Tuskegee Airman who trained at Tuskegee with us, Dr. Hill Pouncey. Dr. Pouncey, could you stand, please? And we have an airman, fighter, bomber, pilot who served in the Korean and Vietnam Wars. That is Lieutenant Colonel Edgar Lewis. Just stand, please. And another guest is Ms. Michiko Williams, who is on the national board of the Tuskegee Airmen, Inc. organization. Education through preservation. As African Americans, I know that our history is so important, not only to be a part of books, but also to be tangible. And by that, I make sure that when I write and I discover our history, that either a street gets recognized and renamed, or markers are along the street, that either a building is named and historical markers at the location of that event. So that again is what our people must do to make sure that our youth see the history, read the history, ask questions of their elders so they can pass on the history. And I want to say hello to a gentleman I met not long ago and was so enlightened. And hello to you, sir. Met you, thank you. Yes, it's awesome, the books you had. But in talking about the Tuskegee Airmen history, I'm just going to talk briefly about what caused me to write the book called Flyin. They were bringing it in the car. Sorry, we got caught in traffic. It was kind of really just piled up for a moment coming around from 20 to 75, 85. So they're bringing up the book. But Flyin is a book that 3 African Americans, which includes myself as the author, and 2 other blacks wrote. Troy Jones is the illustrator, And Cheryl is our graphic designer, Miss Cheryl Henry. The book is designed for ages 5 through 12, for kindergarten through 6th grade. It has different levels of activities, and it's a chronology of some significant events about the Tuskegee Airmen. Why did we do that? It's because we heard that, number one, is that from kindergarten to 4th grade is when the literacy gap begins. So we thought it's great to read books and those that are fictional. But how could we do something to impact that gap and give them history? So as they're getting to color, they can also read some history and hopefully retain it and pass it on to others. So we decided to start with the Tuskegee Airmen because I have been working with the Tuskegee Airmen now for about 6 or 7 years. It started with me working with the Tuskegee Airmen because from my hometown in Indianola, Mississippi, we had a pilot that was killed in combat. His name was Lieutenant Quitman Walker. His plane was shot down when he was returning from a mission over in Hungary. I grew up in Indianola, left in '69, but was back 2-3 times a year. Until 2004, no one had ever mentioned that gentleman. And when I found out that, number one, we had someone who had given the greatest sacrifice for our freedom, I realized I've got to do something about it. We cannot. Those of us who are still able to walk and talk is not turn back and say thank you to our ancestors. That is, number one, what's required of us. So I decided to look for Quitman's body, found out that his body remains in Belgium in an American cemetery. When his parents found out about his death in 1943, because the war was still on, you weren't able to recover bodies from the enemy territory. So when the war ended in Germany in '45, the family were notified, we can now, recover your son's body and bring him home. And the father responded, we have already had so much pain, we will let him rest there. So they left his remains there, and for the first time in 60 years, in my locating his body, we sent flowers. So Quitman Walker is a part of a book that I've written about, because there are many Quitmans. He just happens to be one from my hometown. I hope that here in Atlanta, we will take the time to remember those too. It does not have to be from the Air Force. It can be the Army, the Marines, any branch of the military. Because those are the men and women who are doing the most so that we can do what we do. So when you hear the Tuskegee Airmen history, most people think about the pilots, and they think about the ones who, of course, when you see Red Tails or the HBO movie, seldom do we think about the reality that more than 60, they say 66, but we found out about 72 were killed in combat. The Tuskegee Airmen program or experiment began in 1941. The first to train was the ground crew. Among the ground crew would be the mechanics, those who would work on the armorers, but they were the first to train because, again, this is going to be a program training blacks to fly. So as a segregated program, they made sure blacks would be the ones working on those aircraft. In July of '41, the pilots would start to train. Now the pilots, 1/3 would get their license. That's the number, about 994. But some 3,000 went through that program as pilots. It said for every plane that flew, it took about 10 men working on the ground to maintain what was needed for the aircraft. So now we're thinking, here it is, we've got not only some 3,000 men who was trained to fly, but we've got at least 9,000 to 10,000 people on the ground. That does not include the nurses, the clerks who actually were working in the offices as secretaries. There were women who kept the flight log of the men. One of them was Miss Sarah Plumer, who lives here. So today, Tuskegee Airmen comprises men and women, military and civilian, black and white. And I say white because the men had not yet served in combat. Those that would train them were white. Now, the first that group were getting trained, as far as when they were starting out in basic, they would be trained by instructors that were black. And if I didn't get that right, I'm sure Mr. Pouncey will correct it for me, but the first instructors, before they went onto the military side, were black. Then once they got to Tuskegee Army Airfield, the instructors were white. So when you hear Tuskegee Airmen, we have to tell the story correctly, only because, again, history should be told in the context as it was, not from our own perspective. So black and whites, men and women, military and civilian, are part of the Tuskegee Airmen experience. In 1943, so the men were trained in 41, the first pilots to get their wings, the first class would get their wings in March of 42, but it would be a whole year later before they would go overseas. They wouldn't go overseas until the spring of 43. So this year is actually the 70th anniversary of when the men would go overseas to enter combat. That would include the pilots and the ground support. When the first group that went over, they were known as the 99th, the 99th Pursuit Squadron. Later, about a year later, they would join up with 3 other squadrons known, and they would become the 332nd. So the first to go over in 43 was the 99th. Then they would join up with the 100th, 301st, and 302nd squadrons. Now we've got 4 squadrons. Guess what? In the European theater, all the white squadrons only had 3. All of the white groups only had 3 squadrons. The Tuskegee Airmen would be the only one that had 4 squadrons. And also for the 99th. The 99th was a little disappointed. When they found out that they would be joining up with the 332nd, they said, we've already been here. We've been fighting. Matter of fact, they had received already 2 distinguished unit citations. And they really did not want to join with the 3 black squadrons, because they felt what you're doing again is segregating us. So if you meet some of the Tuskegee Airmen who were with the 99th, they'll tell you that we were already over. We were helping white guys, and we did not think that now we need to come over and become a part of just a segregated squadron, or actually a group again. When they flew with the 332nd, first of all, the 99th that went over in 43, the 99th during their time for the first year did not fly P-51s. It's when the 332nd was there that they would fly the P-51s known as the Red Tails. So when we hear Tuskegee Airmen, most people get excited about those red tail planes. They would fly for a whole year. It would be a year before they would go and start flying P-51s. So the Tuskegee Airmen history for me is not about that whether or not they lost any bombers. Once there was word that they had lost no bombers at all. Then someone did research and said, well, they lost about 25, which is still much fewer than any of the other groups that were in the European theater. Some said, well, they were the best of the best. What makes their story special to me is no other group faced the adversity that the Tuskegee Airmen faced. They didn't even know who their enemies were, because on their native soil, right here at home, there were whites who were determined not to have them win, not to make this experiment become a success. Then they get overseas. And when they're overseas, they're not put out where some whites are in the beginning. They're kept farther from the line doing strafing missions. And I would learn from the airmen themselves, some who came back that I've met, who would say the strafing was the worst, because then you're shooting at the enemy closer to the ground. So now the fire is liable to get you if someone is shooting up because you're flying lower to the ground, shooting at trains, at buildings that might have the enemy ammunition or whatever that's in it that they needed to destroy. So the Tuskegee Airmen at first were doing strafing missions, the most dangerous. Then finally, because so many bombers were being lost, and the bomber aircraft at the time, the B-17s and B-24s, were transporting at least 10 men. 10 men were part of the bomber group. So the Tuskegee Airmen, who were the fighter pilots, it would only be one in a plane. But for the bombers, there were at least 10. So every time a plane went down that they were escorting, at least 10 people died. So you figure if 3 planes went down, that's 30 men. So now, for the first time, they realize we're losing too many bombers. Let's bring these black guys in. Let's see what they can do to help. So that's when they bring the 332nd in. For a while, they did fly some P-47s, which are Thunderbolts, but the fastest plane for them was the P-51. And that is the one they're most known for, because that was a faster plane. And of course, that's when they are now becoming escorts. They're no longer just strafing. On occasion, they still did. But one of the main focuses became escorting bombers. The bombers congratulated them for sticking close to them. They said it seemed like when the red tails were flying with them, they stayed closer to their planes. They stayed closer. Because unfortunately, we don't have a number that's validated saying any of the Tuskegee Airmen became aces. An ace is a pilot who shoots down 5 or more enemy aircraft. We have one that Mr. Archer, Lee Archer, who is said to have shot down 4.5. Now, I don't know how the half works, but that's what he's said to have shot down. So, back to what makes the Tuskegee Airmen a success. To me, it's not about being an ace. It was about showing in the face of adversity that, you know what? We can perform just as well as you can when we're given opportunity. And that's exactly what they did. These men proved, while they're fighting 2 enemies, the enemy overseas and the enemy at home, that they learned to fly, that they were skillful flyers, and they were also creative. Because there were times I was told by one of the men that there was a part they did not have at the base. Know what they did? They found a way to make it work. And that's not new to some of us. We know that all our lives, we as black people have been problem solvers. We found ways to make things work. We did. We are thinkers. We are intelligent. That's what the Tuskegee Airmen proved, that no matter how you try and hold me down, no matter what subordinate or inferior equipment you give me, no matter what I might lack as far as what you think I do, let me prove you wrong. And that's what they did. They did it over and over, including on a mission to Berlin. On a mission to Berlin, which was the longest mission that the Tuskegee Airmen had flown, they didn't have the 110-gallon tanks that was needed for that flight. So the men, and this is a write-up, and the gentleman is still alive, Mr. George Watson, said, we realized, as a matter of fact, this would have been happening on the night before they would go to Berlin. They really had orders that they would be doing something else. It would be a strafing mission, is what he has written. That we were anticipating the next day to go on a strafing mission. But in the afternoon, about 4 o'clock, we heard that, oh no, you're going to be going to Berlin on a long mission. But they didn't have the large tanks that they needed for the fuel for that trip. So what did they do? They went and actually brought the fuel back. Because they said, we didn't have time to wait to get the order to us. And Mr. Watson received a citation. And it doesn't specifically say what it's for, but today he explains what it's for. He said, because had it been told that we really went and got those fuel tanks from a train and brought it back and got it installed on those planes, had we not been successful, we would have been put out of the military. And Colonel Davis would have looked really bad. But it was a success. So because it was a success, they now talk about it. Their ingenuity in bringing tanks that normally they might not have had. But that, again, is just one example of these airmen who not only were they skillful, but they could think. How do we do this? How do we make us look good? And that is what the airmen also did in their thinking. They were the kind of people about the us. Somehow we've forgotten about the us. See, they realized when they went overseas, or actually they realized when this program came into existence, it was not just going to reflect on them if they did not learn to fly or earn military wings. Let me say, blacks were already flying now before the Tuskegee Airmen program. They had what you call civilian license. So some of the airmen that came to Tuskegee already had a pilot's license. What we had not been doing, we had not been flying as pilots in the military. That's what the experience was for. Are blacks able to maneuver quickly enough? Are they able to think fast enough if they're in combat? Because there was a report that said, number one, our brains were smaller than whites. That number two, we would not make good leaders. That number three, when it came time to be agile, that we probably didn't have the ability to maneuver like we should. I guess if we look at sports today, we know that we could say, okay, you guys really didn't know, you did not know who we were. But again, the Tuskegee Airmen story is not about that. It is about, in spite of the obstacles that they overcame. I hate we don't have many young people here. See, we need to let them know who the Tuskegee Airmen were. They had to overcome adversity and fight for a nation that showed them no love. Why would I say that? Because some of those men from the 99th who would come back to the United States, among them being a gentleman named Charles Dryden, A-Train. A-Train came back and he said at one of the bases that he was stationed at, there were prisoners, German and Italian. And those men were allowed to eat in an area where they couldn't eat. They were able to go into facilities they couldn't even go in. And here they are, Americans who fought, and some died, some of their friends, for our freedom. But yet our enemies were allowed to do things in this country that they could not do. But did Colonel Dryden turn to Haiti? Probably within himself, he carried something, but you know what? Whatever he carried, he was a gentleman, because he was always about respecting, about dignity, about excellence. Even though probably his heart was breaking, he still was about dignity. That's the story of the Tuskegee Airmen for our next generation, or for our generation going forward, is that in spite of whatever you go through, don't let anybody break your spirit. Don't let them take away who you really are. Because we as a people have subdued much. Since slavery onward, we're still standing. And perhaps one of the greatest legacy of the airmen They were the first who really stood up for human rights. Because see, when they were fighting for equal rights and the right to fly, that allowed Asians entered the military, Hispanics, or we call them Latinos too, they entered the military. So you might even see sometimes on TV they had an Asian unit that got a lot of, again, recognition. But they admit it was when the blacks entered and started standing up for human rights that opened the door for them. So it's not just the legacy of these men overseas, of the men down at Tuskegee in the war, but it's the pride of these men, like a Dr. Pouncey, who endured, but it did not stop them from showing that they were intelligent, that they were passive or non-violent in taking stands, because they had to. They boycotted theaters. There were officers' clubs, and even though the blacks were officers, they would not let them in. They didn't take it. They didn't take it without marching. Well, they actually boycotted the theater. They had a letter writing campaign at Selfridge Field because there's a place called Loughberry Hall, and they wanted to go in. So they ended up closing. The whites closed the base. They closed Loughberry Hall, the officers' quarters there. A friend of mine was laughing and kind of telling me when I talked to him about the Tuskegee Airmen and their non-violent stand, and perhaps being the first before the Civil Rights Movement. They were certainly the first. And said, wow, poor Dr. King didn't know. He went all the way to India. But in this country, his own people 20 years earlier in the 1940s had taken a stand non-violently for equal rights. They didn't have a Gandhi to teach them. They didn't. The Tuskegee Airmen just had something, and I'll call it that inner strength, that inner wisdom that they had. And if we want to call it that it's ancestral, passed down to them, they showed it. And in flying that $1 million aircraft, this metal that's so expensive, they proved, yes, we can do the same as you, is given that opportunity to fly. I'm not going to take up more of your time. I want to leave with saying this. In 1949, just before they desegregated, as far as a unit, the 332nd was still together. The war ended in 45. The Tuskegee Airmen returned to Tuskegee, those who did not choose to leave the military. So they returned to Tuskegee, but in 1946, that flying program closed for the military at Tuskegee, and they ended up going to Lockbourne in Columbus, Ohio. So blacks were still flying, working the aircraft again as blacks only. And in 1949, in May of 49, there was a competition. This competition, for the first time ever, invited blacks to participate to fly with whites. They would fly in Las Vegas for 10 days, shooting at targets on the ground and in the sky. This competition that the Tuskegee Airmen, or the 332nd, participated in they flew conventional aircraft, which are the propeller aircraft. They flew against 4 other teams, all white. And when that competition ended at the end of 10 days, the Tuskegee Airmen won. So they proved again that when we are given an opportunity to compete with you, that we are equal, if not superior. The Air Force presented them a 3-foot-high trophy. Because it was the Air Force trophy, the next year it was to travel and be given to the next winning team. Somehow that trophy went into storage or wherever, but for 55 years, the airmen never saw the trophy again. I located that trophy. And a book I wrote entitled First Top Guns is really the saga of what it took to get the Air Force to put on display the first Top Gun trophy. I was told it was not important, but I realized that in this country, a first has always been important. Is it just because blacks were involved it's not important? So the pursuit, of course, again, no one can do anything alone. I had the help of some others. Once they found out the story of the trophy, the men didn't know where it was, and I had found it. So I had some others come on board, and that trophy today is out on display at the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. I do hope that you will get a chance to buy the book, First Top Guns, and also the coloring book, because unless you know really the history as it was, you might hear it really misinterpreted. I'm going to share my time with the Tuskegee Airmen, because after all, I can stand here and tell you some things, but it's nothing like hearing it from someone who lived it. Dr. Pouncey, would you be kind enough? I'll tell you a little bit about Dr. Pouncey. Let me get my little thing here. Dr. Pouncey is a world traveler. He trained as an aviation cadet, and he would later transfer to the bomber side. So he could tell you his experiences and share with you from being at Tuskegee what that was like, along with going on further to work overseas in Saudi Arabia. So I want to share my time and give up my time to Dr. Pouncey. And then we'll have Colonel Edgar Lewis share his story. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you. Thank you. I have prepared here a speech. But how do you speak to your family? You don't come home out of college and give a speech. You just start talking. So today I think I'll start talking by asking a question. Who was the first mayor of Detroit?
Coleman Young.
What was Coleman Young?
He was a Tuskegee Airman.
Right. Absolutely right. Who was the Secretary of Transportation in the Ford administration? W.T. Coleman. William Coleman was a Tuskegee Airman. I know them. I told jokes with them. I told lies with them. Now, when I get through talking, I have here a bunch of nails and one nail. If you ask me some questions about these nails, I will tell you the answer. If you don't ask the question, I won't talk about the nails, okay? About 8 days ago, more or less, question about that too. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Mm-hmm. Okay. About 8 days ago, I celebrated my 91st birthday. Now, thank you. Thank you very much. I want you to know that in 91 years, I did a lot of living. The Tuskegee Airmen years were only 3 of them. So in my lifetime, there have been 3 things that made me want to stop, sit up, listen, and think. I want to list them here. My memories as a Tuskegee Airman, my memories of 6 years in the hot, oil-rich, dusty, dry country of Saudi Arabia, and memories of the first inauguration of the President and Vice President of the United States. Not the second, the first of the Black President. Now, on January the 20th, 2009, Washington, D.C., I was very fortunate, very humble, and extremely thankful to sit and watch history play itself out. So I sat on that cold day, and take my word for it, it was cold. is my disbelief at what was happening. I actually saw a black man being sworn in as president of the United States and leader of the greatest nation in the free world. Now, I thought of my grandson, because I could bring one guest. I said, come on down, grandson. Sorry, Pop, I gotta take my exam. Well, not too bad. After all, he was going to the best school in the world, certainly the best school in the United States. He's a now recent graduate from Harvard. I'm very proud of that. I'm also proud of the fact that I grew up with my grandparents. My grandmother couldn't read at all. My grandfather could barely write his name. So from my point of view, we have made a wee bit of progress. Now I want to skip around and share some memories of Saudi Arabia. I think it's right to do so because that's where a lot of oil comes from. And the Islamic religion, Islamic culture, Islamic people are becoming more and more part of our daily lives. So this place is different. The dress is different. The climate is different. The food is different. No pork. Isn't that terrible? You can't have any pork, bacon for breakfast. Isn't that an awful place to live? Ooh, that's terrible.